Hi, I'm Becky Anderson, and welcome to Authors Revealed. I'm so excited. We have award-winning journalist Alison Flowers here with her first published nonfiction piece called The Exoneree Diaries, The Fight for Innocence, Independence, and Identity. It's a story of four people who were accused wrongly and imprisoned for almost 80 years in total for these four people and how they were exonerated. But it's also about their lives after being exonerated and how hard it is to assimilate back into society and feel like they can lead any kind of normal life. Alison, welcome to Naperville and Anderson's. It's so great to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I know you're going to be in our LaGrange store tonight. I wish you were in our Naperville store tonight, but thank you so much for coming and doing that event. But congratulations, your first book is out in the world, that baby, and only for a little over a week, not even a week yet, right? Technically.
Yes, the
right?
launch date was Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Yes.
So how does it feel? Because I can't imagine the amount of what you put into this book. I mean, the research and all the interviewing and everyone you must have talked to tell the story of these four people. But what does it feel like to have it finally out there?
You know, I've been waiting for it for such a long time, and then the pre-orders were being filled. So then by the time the actual release date came, I was like, oh yeah, my book is out today. I should probably say or do something to commemorate this. But of course, it's a really great feeling and very satisfying after working on it for almost 4 years.
Almost 4 years. Wow, that's incredible. So I know some of the seeds, and you can tell a bit about what Be Easy and everything, but where did the seeds really start to grow for the book itself? And then maybe for just the stories of these four individuals, where did all that begin for you? You know, the interest in wanting to know, and you know, the title itself says what it is, the Exoneree Diaries, and sort of a diary of these four people and what they're still going through after being exonerated.
Yeah. For me, I decided to start working on this project while I was at the Medill Justice Project at Northwestern University. So it was a journalism-based innocence project. And while I was there, I was investigating potentially wrongful murder convictions. So I was sort of on the front end of this thing, you know, trying to free the innocent from prison. And then one day it kind of occurred to me, well, what happens when the innocent are freed from prison? What's in place for them? What systems are in place? What resources are in place? And I discovered to my horror that there really wasn't anything. And so I thought, well, this is really sort of an unexplored area of the innocence world that needs to be covered. So I started interviewing exonerees, and suddenly I had enough together for a series which was on Chicago Public Media. And when it came time to do the book, I felt it was really important to include a woman to the fray of the three men that I was focusing on in Cook County, which is the wrongful conviction capital of the country. It has the highest amount of exonerations.
Right. And her story is incredible, and it's so different when you hear these stories. What the difference, what it is for women, especially women who are child care. You know, they're within. You know, they do that type of thing, whether they're a parent or they do some kind of child care, or they're taking care of someone else. They're caregivers. The situation for them is very different than it is for men sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So most women who are wrongly convicted, about 43%, like Christine Bunch in my book, are wrongly convicted of killing or harming a child or loved one under their care. And it does show that, you know, women often being the caregiver in a situation, you know, sometimes they're the only adult around when something goes wrong, when someone is hurt. And so, you know, they're a clear target for that. And in many of their cases, in 2/3 of their cases, there was no real crime that actually occurred. It was an accident or a false accusation or something like that. So that's sort of what Christine's story serves to tell, because she was wrongly convicted of killing her own son in a fire that consumed her home in Indiana.
Right. And her life, I mean, considering she was pregnant when she went into prison, and even the relationship she has with that child who was born is so, I cannot imagine. This is not, you cannot fathom what has happened to these people and what happens to them when they finally are exonerated. It's just incredible. So the Be Easy series, so tell us a little bit how that came about, and that kind of led into the book for you, I'm guessing.
Right. So once I started interviewing 3 exonerees who were men, at about February of 2013, I realized that I had something good to put together. So I pitched it to Be Easy, and we decided to do a year-long series where I would chronicle their lives in a blog and do radio spots. And that's sort of how it came to be. I mean, the men trusted me. They let me into their lives. I started following them around at work and things like that, you know, in their personal lives. And, after a year, there was really great content that I thought could be repurposed for a book. And again, I wanted to add a woman's story to it to depict the unique challenges that women face.
Right, and that series was great. I listened to a lot of them when we were driving in the car. It was just brilliant listening to those. So I loved the beginning of the book because you put a proverb in there that is so perfect, but also the poem that was written by one of the first people to be exonerated and taken off death row, wasn't it? Is that
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit. I love both of those elements because I love looking at that when I open any book for the first time.
Yeah, I thought it would really set the tone. David Keaton is a poet who was released from death row, and he died in recent years. And when he died, a lot of his exoneree friends shared that poem. And I kind of held on to it because I thought it would make a kind of a nice prelude to the book. And one line in it that he says is, feeling like you're neither jelly or solid, like you're kind of in this in-between stage. And on the cover of the book, there's also a bird that's sort of flying between two structures, and that's sort of the exoneree experience. They don't really know which world they fit into anymore. They're not a prisoner anymore, but that's also the only home they've known for decades, and they don't really belong in the free world anymore either because they still feel very much burdened by their incarceration.
Right, and I love the story with I think it's Jacques, how he that first night after he's been released, having to get a knife out of the kitchen.
Right.
I mean, just not feeling even safe because of the environment you've been in, but you're in a completely different environment that you cannot make any connection with. Yeah.
And that's something that a lot of exonerees report and experience are feelings of paranoia, not wanting to be in crowds, symptoms of PTSD. It's very similar to, the trauma that a war veteran faces. And suddenly they're back in the real world and they don't really know how they fit in, and they're just, scared. In Jacques' case, he was very fearful that the detective who had originally hunted him down in his original case that led to his wrongful conviction, he was very fearful that this man was going to come find him and shoot him in the back as he's walking home in the alleyway, because he would have to turn his back in order to access the home. And so these are the things that really kept him up at night. And he reports to me anyway that he still has that butcher's knife underneath his mattress.
Wow. So also too, you talk about the definition of exoneree, because you can think of all the other parts of speech that make up this word, but this word, it does not exist in any dictionary.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about it, because that is so interesting, and that was such a great way to open the book. I thought was really great.
Thank you. And putting a word that isn't real in the title of your book is somewhat of a risk for a publisher and an author, but we felt that it was really important to do, because if we're not going to use the word in writing a book about exonerees, which is really the first of its kind, this subject hasn't been tackled before, then who else is going to do this? And so we have the noun exoneration, we have the verb to exonerate, but there is no word for the innocent person leaving prison. And I think that really speaks to just how erased and forgotten this community of people is.
Right. And when you think about the Innocence Project and all the things that have happened at Medill and Northwestern with the Justice Project and all those things, and you go back through time immemorial, how many people have been wrongfully put to death or have been incarcerated who have been totally innocent but haven't had a voice for them. And I know you speak a lot in this book about these 4 individuals, and you think of all the other people, but who are the real heroes, do you think, that help them in the court system themselves, or helps they never stop fighting to get them out?
Right.
Who are some of those individuals, and those ones that really impressed you in all the work and the research that you've done?
Right. Well, I really wanted to parallel these stories, these powerful stories of exonerees, sort of after the heroes myth. Yeah. So not to say that the exonerees themselves are heroes. Right. Of course, their actions are very heroic at times. But in order to, descend into the depths and then emerge victorious, even though really release from prison is just another beginning of another journey, you have to have someone to accompany you. You have to have a friend, a helper. And those helpers in this book, in this case, are the lawyers, the journalists, the students, the investigators, the PIs who agree to, without many resources, take on these cases and hear someone's cry for help and help them win their freedom.
Yeah. And I think Chicago, and even on the front of of the New York Times this past weekend talking about how many shootings there were and how many deaths there were. Chicago is in the news all the time. And it's not just for, gun violence that's going on, but it's also the brutality within the police department and the county itself. Do you think because of all these things that have happened, and some people have been exonerated, but the torture and everything that went, are things getting better, do you think, within the police department and the justice system in Cook County and in the city of Chicago?
I don't think so. I think that the media is calling more attention, and citizens themselves, through their own transparency efforts, are sort of taking responsibility with the city to hold officials and systems of power accountable. So I think we're seeing more of what's going on regarding police misconduct, but I think it's been going on all along, and I don't think that it's getting better. I think a danger in thinking of the torture under former Commander John Burge as being a closed chapter is thinking that that's somehow a thing of the past, where we know that that still goes on today. And 97% of police misconduct in Chicago goes undisciplined. And there's a strong connection between police misconduct, official misconduct, and wrongful convictions. We're able to track exonerations now and see what the contributing factors were. And official misconduct accounts for more than half of exonerations.
And that's happening all over the country in certain communities, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So how did you decide to feature these four? Out of, of all the people who have been exonerated and they've gotten out of prison, why these four? And I know Christine's story is very, very powerful, but why these four? And especially after their time getting out and what their lives are like now. So why these four?
Well, one, they're racially diverse, and I thought that was important to show, one, that a wrongful conviction can happen to anyone. Sure. So Christine, a white woman, didn't even have so much as a parking ticket on her record. But it also, minorities bear the brunt of wrongful convictions, especially in Illinois, where among the wrongful convictions and exonerations we've seen, 85% are minorities. And so two of the people in the book, of the four, are minorities. I thought that was really important to portray. The other thing is that by selecting these particular cases, it allowed me to show different flaws of the criminal justice system, to show where it really breaks down. So we see a false confession, we see perjury, we see false or misleading forensic evidence, and all the things that go into a wrongful conviction, including the official misconduct. And we see that play out in these four cases.
Right. So tell us a little bit about each. But okay, Jacques Rivera, a little bit about him. He has 3 young children when he goes in, and I think he's 25 or so, and he doesn't get out for 20 years.
Right.
Tell us about his story just a little bit, and what is happening in his life right now.
Right. So Jacques Rivera was a former gang member who was mistakenly identified on a murder charge by a 12-year-old boy witness. And that 12-year-old boy witness was pressured into identifying Jacques, even though he knew that it wasn't Jacques who committed the murder that he witnessed. That boy became a man, and 20 years later, he recanted his testimony, which led to Jacques earning his freedom. Of course, while Jacques was in prison, he ultimately rejected the gang life and found a life of faith. And that's what he tried to play out on the outside. But of course, finding that faith and life on the outside isn't the same as it is in prison. As I mentioned, suffering from symptoms of PTSD, extreme paranoia, and really one of his first moments of freedom that he embraces for himself is doing a load of laundry at the laundromat. For him, that was a really big moment because it was the first time he had the courage to leave his sister's home where he was living and walk a block away by himself.
Right. And now his children, they're grown. I think the oldest was 28 or 29 when he gets out. I mean, how do you even begin to have a relationship now that your children are now adults, and maybe you've just seen them through, on short visits, and it's just
right.
I can't imagine.
Well, from observing the relationship between Jacques and his sons, he also has a daughter and another son. It was interesting to see the familiarity that they still do have, even though they were separated by a long incarceration. But, Jacques, in his moments of frustration, wishes they would be closer. And he kind of says, I don't know them, they don't know me anymore. And, when he was first released, he pored over their photo, or he saw them in person, and he realized that after years of looking at their photographs that they weren't the same people in the photographs. And to him, that was almost like a betrayal because those photographs were so dear to him in prison. And when he finally saw them in the flesh, he realized that he'd gotten it wrong in his head somehow. He didn't really know who they were. So that was really disturbing to him. But, you know, he has grandchildren now. And so there are ways to kind of breathe new life into those relationships.
And it's interesting, he forgave the 12-year-old boy who gave the false.
He did. He did.
Which is just incredible.
He did that almost immediately when he was released and the media was clamoring towards him. He said that, you know, he forgives Orlando and that he doesn't blame him for what happened. He was just a scared 12-year-old boy.
Right. And then you had Antoine Day. What about him and his story and what's happening with him now?
Yeah. Antoine is the exoneree in the book who has been out the longest. He was released in 2002 after about a 10-year stint in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And he was convicted for the number one reason people are wrongly convicted, and that's for a false accusation or perjury when someone testifies against you and lies in the courtroom. And it's so easy to do, right? That's something that, you know, you can think would be incredibly easy, and it is, and it happens all the time. When Antoine was released, he still very much felt like the state had him in his back pocket, in their back pocket, so that they would still be kind of profiling him and tracking him. And even during the year that I spent following his life, you know, he had been released for almost 10 years at that point, or more than 10 years at that point. And still, you know, an officer was looking for him because he ran his license plate and murder was still showing up on his record, even though it should have been expunged. And so he just sort of feels like he's forever behind this wall of suspicion. And on top of that, Antoine didn't really realize that he was an exoneree. Of course, he knew he was innocent of the crime he committed, but he didn't know there was a word for it. He didn't know that in Illinois, starting in 2008, that you could seek compensation because of a new law in Illinois to do that. And so he didn't know any of those things. And so for him, he sort of didn't automatically have that community of exonerees to kind of figure out like, oh, I'm a wrongly convicted person and have that new identity. So identity is an area where Antoine has particularly struggled. But he's made noble efforts. He's started his own organization to try and help other exonerees have a place to stay instead of, you know, being homeless or having to sleep on their mother's couches or like he did, to have actually a home for exonerees to kind of try and rebuild their lives and have a moment of pause, you know, after what can be a very chaotic release with a lot of media attention, or in his case, no notice at all, no media attention, not even his family to be able to be there or his own clothes on his back.
Wow, that's incredible. Now he's helping someone that was for something he didn't receive himself. That's pretty brilliant. And then James, it's Kloppenberg, right? Kloppelberg, okay. And for arson and what happened with him, that we're
Right.
I mean, he's another incredible story. The kind of person he was, and then to be convicted of this crime. It's
Right.
Just, yeah.
James was convicted for, I would say, two main reasons. One is perjury. Again, someone made up a lie and testified against him that he saw James go into the house and set fire to it that killed a family of 6. And the other reason is a false confession. You know, he was beaten by the Burge crew of officers, and shortly after his false confession, Commander Burge made an announcement that he had falsely confessed and had been starting fires his whole life, which was completely fabricated. And even though a Cook County judge threw out that false confession before trials, it really set in motion a prosecution against James that was just sort of irreversible. And it was originally a death penalty case, which later was taken off the table. So it was very serious. An entire family of 6 perished in a fire in James's neighborhood. And he spent the longest time in prison out of the exonerees in the book, almost a quarter of a century. There was a little media attention when he left, but you know, his lawyers didn't really have a place for him to go. He was all the way at Menard Prison, which is about 8 hours from Chicago. I've been there, and there is nothing. There's not going to be a bus to take you back to Chicago. Maybe there is, but if I don't know what it is, you know, a prisoner's not going to know where it is either. And so, you know, James suddenly finds himself free and on a plane for the first time in his life with his lawyers, and they're looking into halfway houses to try and put him up somewhere, which a lot of exonerees don't qualify for that kind of environment. So there really was no place for him. He was at the Holiday Inn near O'Hare for about a week before he went to go live with his estranged son, who only found out about his case by watching the news of his release.
Wow.
And got in touch with his lawyers and allowed James to come live with him and his family. If that hadn't happened, James would have been homeless. So he also struggled very much with finding work. He applied for hundreds and hundreds of jobs. One time he was brought in, he put his wrongful conviction very high up on his resume so that potential employers would see that right away and know that he was wrongly convicted, but still had good work experience from being in prison. And he, went to a job interview where they clearly hadn't done their research on him and said that they don't hire convicted murderers. And that was true because he is a convicted murderer. He was falsely and wrongly convicted of murder, but he still has to check that box. Have you ever been convicted of a crime? And so it really acts against the exoneree.
That's right. That's right. And I think you make a good point in the book is that sometimes those who are truly guilty and are convicted in crimes and get out of prison actually have more resources or more access than those who are wrongly, unjustly convicted and years in prison and yet don't have the resources. And like you said, there are problems with identity, everything. It's just, I don't know how this even makes any logical sense, let alone emotional or any kind of sense in the terms of helping somebody who has been wronged so terribly.
Right. I mean, parolees do have more resources afforded to them than exonerees do. When you're an exoneree leaving prison, you don't have a dime in your pocket. You don't have any compensation. Nothing is automatic. And you perhaps don't even live in a state that would compensate you if you follow the legal process later. If you happen to be wearing an article of clothing that belongs to the prison, you actually might be billed for it later. I have seen exonerees who have been charged for the shoes that they were wearing, the prison detail shoes, $14 or some such like that. Your family has moved on, your parents may have died, your spouse probably divorced you, your kids don't know you, your record isn't automatically expunged. There really needs to be a mechanism for writing it into the orders when someone is released on new evidence for actual innocence, for a judge to say this person needs immediate resources in addition to compensation that may come later through the state or federal government.
Is it happening in any state? Is there any states that are doing it at least better than we are in the state of Illinois or maybe Indiana or Christine? Is there any state that's doing this and doing right by those who have been falsely accused?
I would say that of the 30 states and DC that do have policies to compensate the wrongly convicted, many of these laws fall short. In Indiana, it's not even a state that has a law to compensate exonerees. So Christine hasn't received any compensation, and until there's a law in Illinois to provide for that, she won't, and her record won't be properly cleared. And in Illinois, the most you can get is about $200,000 no matter how long you spent behind bars. So for James and Jacques, who spent in excess of 20 years behind bars, that's not even $10,000 a year. There is a policy in Texas which gives exonerees about $80,000 for every year that they spent behind bars, and some national advocates recommend about that amount, or about $68,000 per year. But there is no uniformity. The point is there is no uniformity between the states, among the states, for exoneree compensation. And for federal cases, there is some level that the federal government will compensate you for, but the federal government isn't going to compensate a state exoneree. And so, the system right now is woefully inadequate, even for states that do have such policies.
So I'm gathering what this book you're hoping will get more attention, and so some of this can be corrected, obviously.
Right. We need a system of aftercare for exonerees, and not just monetary resources. They desperately need counseling, they need medical, they need dental, they need a support system. And those are the things that need to be put in place. Those are the reforms that I would really like to see.
So about you, and how, your interest in journalism or finding the story behind the story, and digging in. What do you remember, maybe your first recollection of wanting to be a journalist or being a writer? Because I know you majored in religion and literature, right? Was that your undergraduate degree?
That was one of the master's degrees, and then I went back in for journalism.
Okay. So what do do you remember what your earliest collection when you were young, maybe, thinking that
Well, my
you
mother is
wanted
going to
be a
love
journalist?
this. I was actually homeschooled for about 6 years, and my mom had a writing curriculum for me that I just consumed. And, it was probably the typical stuff like, replacing a ho-hum verb with a really strong descriptive verb and that kind of thing. But that was sort of my pleasure when I was being homeschooled for those 6 years, is when I really got into writing. And then, of course, I was instilled with sort of a public service mindset. And I realized that those two things come together with journalism, love of writing and also public service. I majored in French in college and taught French for a while, but then I went back to school for journalism at Northwestern University. And when I was working in TV news in Georgia, that's when I really got interested in criminal justice. I was kind of thrown into the crime beat and social justice beat. And so the stories were just so rich down there. It was a treasure trove of information and material. And so that's what really got me interested. And that's when I met my first exoneree, was on the job in Georgia.
Right, I was reading that. That was really, really interesting that you had that basis. So you learned a lot from television news and being a journalist in that way too. So yeah. So being a French teacher, that's what and I read that how is being a teacher and all these different experiences, because you've written for so many journals, newspapers and magazines, and contributed so many things. How have those experiences helped you in the writing of the book and actually putting these stories down and putting it in a narrative format that it reads like such I mean, it's incredible when you think about nonfiction stories, real stories like this that are more incredible than what you could put into something that's fiction.
Well, I think being a French teacher, it was at an all-boys Catholic school. So I'll just say that it made me tough as nails to do this kind of work.
All right, all right, that's good. I love that answer. So what do you hope that people will take away from reading the Exoneree Diaries?
I think I want people to take away two things. One is that wrongful convictions can happen to anyone. I really want people to take away the commonality of it. It seems like something that is rare, that you just see on the news, but in fact it can happen to anyone. And then the other takeaway is that these are really extraordinary people as well as ordinary people, that they really beat remarkable odds to be here with us. It takes a lot of serendipity, almost like winning the lottery, for an organization to take up your case, and then for a judge or panel of judges to throw out your conviction, or a prosecutor to decide to drop charges. And so on the one hand, they're just like you and me. On the other hand, it's just incredible what they have overcome and the resilience they have to keep on living their lives here with us.
Yeah, and that was really surprised me so much about their stories. It's so true. Well, Alison, thank you so much. Congratulations again on the Exoneree Diaries, and thanks so much for sitting down and talking with me.
Thank you for having me.
Incredible conversation with Alison Flowers about her book, The Exoneree Diaries. This is her first book. She's an award-winning journalist. What a great conversation we had about the injustices that are happening in the criminal justice system in Chicago and Cook County. Thanks for joining me on Authors Reveal.